Providence, 1834. Population, 16,000. It's easy to idealize those times as kinder, simpler, even pastoral. But they were not. Some enjoyed a middle-class life or better, but many more who came from Europe to escape poverty or famine found themselves huddling in slums, without work, without hope. But those who suffered the most were their children. Some begged on the streets. Others learned the harshest of lessons at the mercy of mindless machines, hungry for tiny fingers and hands. Because in 1834, 55% of the factory labor force in Providence was comprised of children as young as 7, working 14 hours a day. It was a crueler, darker world, and our young country's heart was still hard and immature. But one woman was determined to make a difference in the lives of poor children. Her name was Harriet Ware, and 175 years ago, she founded the oldest child welfare organization in the state, the Providence Children's Friend Society, known today as Children's Friend.
Harriet Ware was a school teacher born in Massachusetts who was recruited by a church group of benevolent ladies to come to the India Point area of Providence to help teach the city's poorest children.
The general idea about children was that their fates were very much tied to the fates of their parents. So if their parents were paupers, children would probably be paupers. Harriet Ware was, from the very earliest days, a real advocate for this idea that we shouldn't think that children's lives are over simply because their parents are paupers. So she was very much a believer in the poorest of children.
Harriet Ware began her work with these children by starting a Sunday school in the India Point neighborhood, despite advice from community leaders who warned her against it.
I was told by such that the object must be abandoned, that the people were completely savage, that it was an improper place for a female, and that a child 8 years old would turn me out of school. I felt greatly encouraged and was determined at all events to persevere.
The Sunday school soon evolved into a 5-day school and eventually into a home where Harriet took in children who had been abandoned or whose parents could no longer take care of them. She educated them and then tried to place them with new families. Harriet supported her efforts for the children with money she raised from people in the community, whose names are familiar to us even today: Lippitt, Brown, Chafee, DeWolf, Goddard, Ives, and Tillinghast.
Never did the privilege of providing homes for little wretched children appear so valuable. I have often thought that, with or without support, I will never again complain of fatigue or perplexity, as long as one neglected child remains in these streets that I can benefit from removing.
Harriet Ware, as described by her biographer Frances Whalen, who became a lifelong supporter and confidant, was a very plain woman, had a sense of humor, did not make much of an impression on people upon first meeting, had no wealth of her own, had no training to do anything that she ended up doing. So I think what we see in Harriet Ware is an ability to understand her limitations, but also to always push forward with her vision.
The lesson which can be learned from the life of Harriet Ware teaches us that a great power for good is placed in the hands of all of us, if we had but the energy and self-sacrifice to use it.
The Children's Friends Society was founded for the purpose of providing for the support and education of indigent children of both sexes, not otherwise provided for, and who, for want of paternal care, are in a suffering and dangerous condition. The object of the society shall be to rescue from evil and misery such children as are deprived of the care of their natural protectors.
Harriet was able to raise enough money in contributions to buy a small house on the northeast corner of Stewart and Broad Streets to continue the society's work. This remained the home of Children's Friend until 1863.
The first child admitted to our home was a 5-year-old boy, Otis W. Barlow. He remained with us until January of 1845, when his indentures were given up to his mother's husband, Mr. George Gibbs. He now goes to sea. The Macmillan sisters, Mary, 9 years, and Eliza, 7 years, children of intemperate parents, and taken from the extremes of poverty and suffering, found to be remarkably truthful, honest, and amiable. They were taken by Deacon Wiles of Shrewsbury, where they were carefully educated and treated in every respect like daughters.
Harriet Ware was a true social entrepreneur. Harriet had this idea that she could, without having any money of her own, without having any influence really, that she could create something brand new. And she experimented a lot.
Many of the practices Harriet put into place were extremely innovative for the time. She helped not only orphans, but children with poor parents who couldn't take care of their children. She put boys and girls together in the same home. She provided education and training before placing children out with new families. And she developed tracking methods to monitor the children's progress even after they had left the home.
If you look at the records, for example, a journal in the 1850s, there's detailed notes about children who entered the home, chronicling everything that happens to the child. Child went to sea, child married a good man, child became promising despite discouraging influences. So they really did keep quite detailed notes, not only about children as they cared for them, but also as they left the home.
Fundraising presented a major challenge with every passing year.
Surely goodness and mercy have followed us every step of the way. You will not infer that we have had not trials, that no clouds have gathered over us thick and dark, threatening to destroy us. Oh no. God has been too merciful to allow us to be ruined with prosperity. But I believe He has given us as much success as we could possibly bear.
Harriet Ware died in 1847 at the age of 47 from cancer, just 14 years after she began the work of the Providence Children's Friends Society. At its meeting immediately after her death, the board resolved,
"This institution has sustained a heavy and irreparable loss. As individuals, they lament the loss of an intelligent, generous friend. Also resolve that this is the earnest desire of the board to maintain the interests and extend the usefulness of this institution, now bequeathed to them by its self-denying founder."
After Harriet Ware's death, the Board of Managers continued her groundbreaking work. The managers are deeply sensible of the responsibility devolving upon them in the discharge of their important trust. Upon the kind sympathies and liberal aid of a generous public, they rely for the requisite means, with divine assistance, to make this institution a rich blessing to the community. In the mid-1800s, the board of the Society also became leaders in championing other children's rights issues, such as the need for child labor reform. Throughout this period, the Society constantly grappled with its biggest challenge, the need to promote its mission in order to raise funds. If the community generally were more particularly acquainted with this charity, they certainly would be willing and glad to provide means by which many more of the unhappy, homeless children of our city might be brought under the fostering care of this institution. In the early 1860s, the Providence Children's Friends Society was able to break ground on a new, larger home on Toby Street, thanks to a generous donation from the Ives family. A larger home was needed to accommodate a growing number of children at the home, some orphaned because of the Civil War. Can we hope then that the plaintive voice of suffering childhood will rise above the storm of war and make its piteous plea heard and the strife of arms? War, the gigantic producer to evils, is adding its terrible power to the increase of juvenile pauperism. Each severe campaign, each battlefield, prepares orphans for our home. During the Civil War, the Rhode Island General Assembly thanked the Providence Children's Friends Society for its innovative work with a special resolution.
Resolved that the humane and Christian work of gathering within its home and training for usefulness in life neglected and forsaken children meets our warmest approbation, and the entire arrangement of the institution render it a model worthy of imitation. Providence, 1882. Population 116,000. 100,000 more than when Children's Friend Society was formed nearly 50 years earlier. Prior to this time, if someone witnessed severe parental child abuse, there was no legal action that could be taken, because Rhode Island had no laws protecting children from parental abuse. But thanks to the efforts of women in the community, like those who worked for Children's Friend, the state finally passed a law against child abuse in 1882. To police that law, a charitable organization was formed, the Rhode Island Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. It was founded 12 years after the Rhode Island Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals.
The Rhode Island Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was founded by men. They were all male agents, and they were very much a quasi-police force in that they had enormous powers for a private agency. They could go into any home, they could remove any child. It was them who would prosecute parents and send them to jail. It would be them who would collect fines and penalties for parents who abused their children.
RISPCC operated an emergency shelter for abused children on Doyle Avenue. Children were kept at the Doyle Avenue shelter on only a short-term basis until a more permanent solution for each child could be found. Sometimes children were returned to their parents. In other cases, RISPCC tried to place children in foster homes. Children's Friend and RISPCC, which later changed its name to Rhode Island Child Service, competed for funds and resources.
Many people believe that the years between 1880 and 1920 were sort of the high ground for children's reform because so much happened. More legislation related to education, more legislation related to children and public health, more legislation related to child protection. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the country was faced with some pretty significant economic pressures. People were falling on hard times who had never expected to do so. Accordingly, the pressures felt by the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children and Children's Friends were absolutely immense. Donations to the agencies were falling while demand was increasing. And at this time as well, we moved to this idea that if we could provide support for families, that would be a better alternative than removing poor children from their families and having them grow up in an institution. So we do see in the 1920s and the 1930s, as difficult as those times were, a real focus on let's see if through income support to mothers and families, in fact, we can reduce the number of children coming into care, because so many of the children who are coming into care were not because of abuse or neglect, it was because of poverty.
At one time, while I was there were 75 children there. They tried to make it as good as they could, really. Of course, I didn't always think so at the time. They tried to have balanced meals for us, and we always had milk and vegetables. Mrs. Sawyer was the superintendent of the home. Mrs. Thousand was matron. She was in charge of the girls. Mrs. Gleason was in charge of the boys. The nurse at the home was Mrs. Small. She was a very nice person, very nice.
The Children's Friend Society led the move away from institutionalization of poor children by closing its Toby Street home in 1926 and advocating for foster care and family support as better alternatives. A few years later, Children's Friend hired its first professional social worker.
In the 1920s and the 1930s, you begin to see everything about social work professionalizing during this period, being handed over from volunteers to professions who would dedicate themselves to a more scientific approach.
With a dramatic increase in need brought on by the Great Depression and a dwindling availability of charitable donations, both Children's Friend and RISPCC were constantly seeking new ways to raise funds to support their efforts. They both became early members of the Providence Community Fund, a precursor to United Way, an organization founded to coordinate and consolidate charitable donations.
We have to remember that An organization like Children's Friend never got a penny of state funding well into the 30s. In Rhode Island, it was private contributions, private donors that really carried the water for child welfare well into the 1950s.
Children's Friend and Rhode Island Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which later changed its name to Rhode Island Child Service, found themselves in constant competition for funds and resources.
Between 1920 and 1950, there were 4 different plans to merge those two organizations, and they simply weren't ready to get married. In 1949, there was a report and a lot of pressure from the Child Welfare League of America, from United Way, and from other funding organizations, which basically said these two agencies really do need to merge. There's too much overlap and there's so much unmet need that if these agencies merge, they could probably not only save money but improve their services. So 2 very mature executive directors were resigned, and that sort of created an opportunity for this merger. But still, within the first 10 years, it was difficult. They had a board that was close to 100 people, 50 people from each of the partners, very unwieldy.
Providence, 1954. Population just under 250,000, and at its historical peak. The recently merged Children's Friend and Service was 120 years old and was still struggling to find the funds and resources to provide child protective services for the state. The state had not yet taken on this responsibility, and the work of Children's Friend and Service was still largely funded with foundations and private contributions. It was the year Hurricane Carol wreaked havoc in Providence, and the time when Children's Friend and Service finally closed its supposed temporary Doyle Street shelter after providing housing for children for over 70 years.
Children's Friend and Service launched a fundraising drive to build a new facility in Warwick. Called the Lakeside Shelter Home, the facility continued to take in children in protective service for nearly 10 years until the state finally assumed responsibility for child protective service in 1963. Rhode Island was one of the last states to take on the task of protecting children from abuse and neglect. But this left the agency with a need to change course and to find a new use for the Lakeside home. In the 1960s and 70s, Children's Friend and Service chose to concentrate on foster care, adoption services, and counseling help for unwed mothers. The agency turned Lakeside into a home for emotionally disturbed children, but battles for funding and labor strife led to the eventual closing of that facility in 1975 and the end of the line for the agency's residential programs. The 1980s would put the agency on another new course, one that would lead to what it has become today.
Children's Friend had established itself as one of the more prominent United Way agencies and as one of the most successful. It was, however, in 1977, what I might call sleepy. It was certainly doing great professional work, but as services began to evolve in the community and needs of children became even more prominent, there was really a need to take a new look at what the agency was doing.
Around that time, another woman with a social entrepreneurial spirit had started an agency that was targeted to young children at risk. Her name was Lynette Azzy-Lezing.
I started an agency called the Rhode Island Center for Children at Risk and brought together people in the state who understood the importance of starting early with children and families to stop problems from becoming severe, so that these children would really get a best start in life and start school prepared to learn and to succeed. We struggled in terms of getting funding and growing, but we began to attract attention for being very innovative in the approaches that we use.
At that time, the then executive director of Children's Friend, Matt DiCirico, was planning to retire, and the agency was looking for his successor. Knowing the long history of the agency and its excellent reputation in the community, Lynette approached Children's Friend about a merger.
It was a perfect marriage of an organization with a venerable history and an endowment and an opportunity to gain more funding from the private sector and from the state, and an idea and an organization and an enthusiasm which had been lacking at that point.
So Lynette, in her own wonderful way, was reconceptualizing what family services should be in this state. And indeed, as the history of the agency shows, Lynette became the executive director of Children's Friend and Service and took this wonderful approach with her and took this effective but sleepy agency to some wonderful new directions.
One of the goals that I had had for a very long time was to open family support centers in the state that would provide families with essentially one-stop shopping, all the resources that they needed to take good care of their children under one roof.
With funding from the United Way, Children's Friend opened its first family support center in Central Falls in a small rented house. Several years later, with funding from a capital campaign, the agency was able to build a much larger, child-friendly facility. A family support center was also opened in Providence. Today, the agency serves over 17,000 children and families with a wide variety of programs, all designed to help the state's most vulnerable young children.
They deal with the holistic situation of a child and his or her family. And they deal with it from birth right through the time that they enter school. And if you think about it, those are the most formative times in a child's life.
Studies have shown that really you get a much greater return the earlier the age is that you intervene. When they're pretty well formed and in their teens, the odds are not too good at that age.
There are studies coming out all the time right now talking about the benefits of effective early childhood investments. And I'm not just talking about benefits to the child and family, I'm talking about benefits to the community as a whole, to society. There are positive economic paybacks to making these investments in children. And so I think our part is to make sure that we as an agency and as stewards of resources are making those effective investments and really making sure that our programs are high quality and best practice, and also making sure that we're advocating to get the resources to give to these children.
They are focused on results. All along, the impacts and the results are evaluated and assessed so that they can feed that information back into the strategic planning process and continue to grow in the level of service and professionalism that the agency can provide.
In the last 10 or 15 years, has gotten not only state recognition, but some national recognition for being a real leader in child welfare.
I think that just pushes us to continue to find better ways to do things, to make sure that we are making decisions that are based on research and best practice, and to really raise the bar on our services.
I think what's really nice is the fact that this agency was founded to work with high-risk young children. And 175 years ago, we have still stuck to our mission.
They've always managed to retain a core identity. They have been a part of the fabric of a town for a very long time, and I really respect them for that.
If we stay true to our core values, having the highest quality and dedicated staff possible, that we will be able to make a real difference for the future of Rhode Island's children.
Nothing made Harriet Ware happier than to embrace the least promising child, which is a good motto for all of us to live by.